All right, let's go. Number 10. The Pyramids That Drowned. In January of 2019, a small team of archaeologists pulled diving hoses down a staircase cut into bedrock at the edge of the Sahara. They were in northern Sudan at a place called Nuri, where roughly 20 stone pyramids stand in a broken arc against the horizon. These are not Egyptian pyramids. They are Nubian, raised by the kings of Kush between the 7th and 3rd centuries before the Common Era, the rulers the Egyptians once called the Black Pharaohs. Beneath one of the smallest and last of them lies the tomb of a king named Nastasen. To reach his burial chambers, the divers had to descend the ancient steps and then keep going, down past the point where the stone disappeared, under still, dark water. There was no room inside for air tanks. The passages were too narrow, so the team breathed through hoses snaked in from a generator on the surface, crawling through a half-submerged opening, barely the size of a small television. The dives ran for hours at a stretch, day after day, the divers filling buckets with silt and passing them up a human chain to the surface, where the mud was sifted grain by grain for anything the water had spared. What they found below the waterline were the things a Kushite king took with him. Shabtis, the little servant figures meant to work for him in the next life. Fragments of gold foil that had once covered his statues, and a heavy stone slab that is almost certainly the lid of an unopened sarcophagus. Nuri is enormous, and Nastasen is only its final chapter. Once there were more than 80 burial monuments here, the resting places of dozens of Kushite kings and queens across 4 centuries. The first and largest belonged to Taharka, a pharaoh powerful enough to rule both Nubia and Egypt in the 7th century before the Common Era, a king mentioned by name in the Hebrew Bible. His descendants were laid to rest around him, generation after generation, in tombs cut deep beneath their pyramids. When the American archaeologist George Reisner dug here a century ago, he even mistook the skull of a Nubian queen for that of a king. So little did he expect these people to have been what they were. Nastasen ruled Kush for about 2 decades and died around 315 before the Common Era. He was the last king buried at Nuri, and because he came last, his pyramid stands on the lowest ground in the cemetery. That detail matters. What sealed his tomb is not ancient. The chambers are underwater because the water table beneath the desert has been rising. Pushed up by modern dams, by irrigation, by a changing climate along the Nile. The men who built these tombs cut them dry, deep into the rock, expecting them to stay dry forever. They did not. Nuri had been abandoned to scholarship for almost a century. Reisner had worked here in the 1910s, left much of it undocumented, and written the Kushite kings off as pale imitators of Egypt. He was wrong about that. The people buried at Nuri built a kingdom that once ruled Egypt itself, and for a time controlled the Nile from the Mediterranean deep into Africa. When Sudanese protesters filled the streets in 2019, some of them chanted the names of these same rulers, the pharaohs and queens whose bodies still lie under the sand and the water. At least 4 kings' chambers at Nuri remain unexcavated, drowned, and untouched. The divers mapped what they could, filled buckets with silt, and surfaced. Below them, in the darkness of a flooded room, a stone lid still rests over a king who has waited more than 2,000 years, and who the water may keep sealed for good. Number 9. The Painted Tombs of the Etruscans. On a low plateau near the Tyrrhenian coast of Italy, about 40 kilometers northwest of Rome, there is a city with streets and squares and rows of houses and no living inhabitants. It is called the Banditaccia, the necropolis of the ancient town of Cerveteri, and it is one of several vast cemeteries left behind by the Etruscans, the people who ruled central Italy before Rome grew large enough to swallow them. The tombs are cut into soft volcanic rock and heaped over with earth into great round mounds, some of them broad enough to hold a family for generations. Walk down into one, and you find carved stone couches, pillars, and doorways, an entire domestic world reproduced underground for the dead. Not far away, at Tarquinia, the tombs go further. Their walls are painted. There are banquets with reclining couples, musicians with double flutes, dancers, leopards, divers plunging into a painted sea. These are among the oldest large-scale wall paintings surviving from the ancient Mediterranean, and they show the Etruscans as they wish to be remembered, at ease, garlanded, mid-celebration. Cerveteri holds its own marvels. In one tomb, the Tomb of the Reliefs, the walls and pillars are carved and molded with the ordinary furniture of a household: cooking tools, coils of rope, weapons, cushions, even the family pets, so that the dead would want for nothing. Multiply that by scale. The Banditaccia alone contains thousands of tombs spread across a hillside, an entire urban sprawl of the dead laid out with streets and blocks, larger and more orderly than many towns of the living from the same age. The problem is that we can read the rooms, but not the words. Etruscan writing survives in the thousands, scratched onto tombs and mirrors and small offerings, and the script itself is no mystery, because the letters were borrowed from the Greeks and can be pronounced, but the language behind those letters is not related to Latin or Greek or almost anything else. It is not Indo-European. We know a few hundred words, most of them funerary, names and titles and numbers, and beyond that, the meaning thins out and disappears. We can sound out an Etruscan sentence and still have almost no idea what it says. And the tombs already opened are only a fraction of what is there. Ground-penetrating radar and magnetic surveys passed across these fields over the last few decades keep revealing the same thing. Buried chamber after buried chamber. Whole districts of the dead still under the soil, unexcavated and unentered. In 1836, two men, Regolini and Galassi, opened a single untouched tomb at Cerveteri and pulled out a fortune in gold and silver. Most of the necropolis has never been touched at all. What we have lost is not only their speech, but their books. The Etruscans wrote works on religion and ritual that the Romans themselves once studied and consulted, and not one of them survives intact. Rome absorbed the Etruscans, borrowed their gods, their engineering, and their arts of reading, the future enlightening, and the livers of animals, and then let their literature disappear. A whole civilization's library is simply gone. The paintings that have been exposed are fading. Light, humidity, and the breath of visitors do to them what 2,500 years of darkness did not. And many of the finest tombs are now kept sealed, viewed only through glass or on a strict rotation. The Etruscans left us their faces, their banquets, and their alphabet. They did not leave us the key to their own voice, and the tombs still in the ground hold sentences no one alive can read. Number 8. The Hall of 7,000 Dead. In 1902, on the island of Malta, workers were cutting cisterns into the rock beneath a row of new houses in the town of Paula. The island is small and stony, and water has always been precious, so digging tanks into limestone was ordinary work. What was not ordinary was what they broke into. Below the foundations, their tools punched through into a hollow space, and then another, and then a whole descending complex of chambers carved deliberately into the living rock. It is called the Hypogeum of Hal Saflieni, and it is the only prehistoric underground burial temple of its kind anywhere in the world. It runs 3 levels deep, cut entirely by hand more than 5,000 years ago, by people using stone and antler tools before the invention of metal on the island. And it was full of the dead. Estimates of the number of individuals whose bones were placed here run into the thousands, perhaps as many as 7,000 people laid down over many centuries. It had been carved slowly, over something like 1,000 years, beginning before 3,000 before the Common Era, each generation cutting the chambers deeper into the rock. The first person to explore it in any depth was a Jesuit priest named Manuel Magri, who worked through the passages in the early 1900s and then died before he could publish, taking much of his record with him. The task of properly documenting the place fell to Themistocles Zamet, one of the founders of Maltese archaeology, who understood what he was standing inside. The deeper chambers are the strange part. The Neolithic Maltese were above ground, building massive stone temples, and here, underground, They carved the rock to imitate those temples. There are false doorways, corbelled ceilings, and pillars that hold up nothing, all sculpted from solid limestone in the pitch dark, copies of a built world reproduced inside the earth for the dead to inhabit. Many of the walls still carry traces of red ochre, the iron-rich pigment that so many ancient cultures reached for when they buried their people, the color of blood and perhaps of returning life. In one chamber, a small carved figure of a sleeping woman was found, lying on her side as if at rest, one of the most famous objects in Maltese archaeology. In another, known as the Oracle Room, a niche carved into the wall catches a man's voice at a particular low pitch and throws it, resonating through the whole of the underground complex, so that a single word spoken into the stone seems to come from everywhere at once. But here's where the sight turns from a wonder into a warning. When the hypogeum was first opened to the public, the people who came to see it were slowly destroying it. Human breath raises the humidity and the carbon dioxide inside a sealed rock chamber, and that shift in the air was damaging the ochre and the stone. So the authorities did the opposite of what discovery usually demands. They closed it down. Today, the hypogeum admits only a small number of visitors each day, in tightly controlled groups, through airlocks that regulate the atmosphere, and much of the year, the underworld is left to itself, silent and empty. We can measure the chambers to the millimeter. We cannot recover what the red ochre meant, or what was sung in the deep room, whose acoustics make a low voice resonate through the whole complex. The people who carved this place spent generations building a house for their dead inside a rock. To keep it, we have had to shut most of us out. Number 7. The Cemetery of Boats in the Desert. She has been dead for around 3,800 years, and she still seems to be smiling. She wears a large felt hat with a feather in it, a woolen cloak, leather boots. Her eyelashes are intact. She is known as the beauty of Xiaohe, and she was pulled from the sand of the Taklamakan Desert in western China, one of the best preserved ancient human beings ever found. Around her, in a cemetery that rises from the dunes like an oblong hill, hundreds of others were buried the same way, wrapped, clothed, and laid inside coffins shaped like boats and covered with cattle hide. The site is called Xiaohe, and it sits in the Tarim Basin, a place ringed by mountains and filled with one of the driest deserts on Earth. That extreme dryness is why the bodies survived as mummies without any deliberate embalming. A Swedish explorer named Folke Bergman recorded the cemetery in the 1930s, and then it was lost to the shifting sand and the region's turmoil for the better part of 70 years, and not relocated and excavated by Chinese archaeologists until the early 2000s. What they uncovered was a landscape of the dead, studded with tall wooden posts, some shaped like oars, others carved into forms that seemed to represent male and female, planted in the sand above the graves like a forest of markers. There were boat coffins by the score, felt and woven wool, and grains of wheat and millet. And the faces of the mummies did not look the way many people expected the ancient inhabitants of China to look. They looked, to some eyes, European. For decades, that appearance drove a single question: where had these people come from? The favored answers were all migrations. Perhaps they were herders who had ridden east across the steppe from the direction of Europe. Perhaps they were speakers of a lost Indo-European tongue, arriving from far away and carrying a foreign look into the heart of Asia. Then the DNA came back. In 2021, a team sequenced the genomes of 13 of these early Tarim mummies, and the result overturned the migration story completely. They were not recent arrivals from anywhere. Their ancestry was overwhelmingly local and astonishingly old. They descended, almost entirely, from a population geneticists call the ancient North Eurasians, an Ice Age hunter-gatherer people who once ranged across the far north and had, nearly everywhere else, been absorbed and diluted into other groups thousands of years earlier. The Tarim people were a relic. They had survived in genetic isolation, an island of Ice Age ancestry that had almost vanished from the rest of the world, with no sign of mixing with the neighbors who surrounded them. Yet, they were not cut off in the ways that mattered for survival. Chemical traces in the dental plaque of the mummies show they drank milk and kept herds. They grew wheat that had come originally from the west, and millet that had come from the east, and they used plants from Central Asia. They were genetically alone and culturally connected, a people who reached back to the last ice age and ended, quietly, in the sand of a basin that would become one of the emptiest places on the planet. The desert kept their bodies almost perfectly. It did not keep the language they spoke, or the reason they buried their dead in boats in a place with no sea. Number 6. The flower burial. For most of the 20th century, the Neanderthals were the brutes of human evolution. Stooped, dim, incapable of the things that supposedly made us human, they were the failed cousins, the evolutionary dead end. And then, in a cave in the mountains of northern Iraq, an American archaeologist found something that seemed to break that picture apart. The cave is called Shanidar, high in the Zagros Range in Iraqi Kurdistan. Between the 1950s and 1960s, Ralph Selecki excavated the remains of 10 Neanderthals there. In 1960, in his last season, his team lifted one of them out of the ground still encased in a block of sediment, a male they labeled Shanidar 4. When the soil around him was analyzed, it was found to contain dense clumps of ancient pollen. A specialist studied that pollen and concluded it came from wildflowers, whole flowering plants, as if the body had been laid down on a bed of blossoms. The interpretation was electric. Here, it seemed, was a Neanderthal, buried with flowers, tended in death, mourned. The story traveled around the world, and Shanidar became famous as the flower burial. And the flowers were not the only reason the cave unsettled the old picture. Among Solecki's Neanderthals was an individual known as Shanidar 1, an older man whose bones told a hard story. He had suffered a crushing injury to the right side of his body, leaving his arm withered and probably useless, damage to his eye socket that may have left him blind on one side, and a scatter of other healed wounds. And yet he had lived on for years after those injuries. Someone, it seems, had helped him survive at a time when he could no longer fully fend for himself, in a species we had assumed incapable of that kind of care. What makes the flower burial difficult is that the flowers may never have been flowers at all. When the block of sediment was finally opened in a museum in Baghdad, the soil crumbled during transport, and much of the precise context was lost. So the exact relationship between the pollen and the body could never be pinned down. And in the years since, researchers working in the same cave have offered a plainer explanation. The floor of Shanidar is riddled with the burrows of solitary bees, some of them half a meter deep, and those bees carry an abandoned pollen exactly where it was found. The particular mix of flowers in the pollen could not all have bloomed in the same season, which is hard to square with someone gathering them at a single moment of grief. The bed of flowers, on the current evidence, is most likely the work of insects, not of Neanderthal hands. But the collapse of the flowers did not empty the cave of meaning. Between 2018 and 2022, a new team returned and excavated beside Selecki's old trench, and they found more of the same cluster, including a Neanderthal now called Shanidar Zed, resting in deposits around 70,000 years old. What they saw was not a random scatter. The bodies had been placed, again and again, in the same feature in the cave floor, a channel that appears to have been deliberately dug deeper to receive them. The flowers may be a story we told ourselves. The care was real. Neanderthals were returning to one particular spot in the dark and laying their dead there on purpose. A species that was not us, doing something we recognize. The pollen can be counted grain by grain. The feeling behind the placement cannot, and that is the part that still holds. Number 5. The pond that kept its brains. In 1982, near the town of Titusville in central Florida, a backhoe operator was clearing muck out of a small pond to make way for a housing development when he turned up a human skull. The reasonable first thought was murder, and the police were called. But the medical examiner took one look and realized the bone was far too old for any crime he could prosecute. He called the archaeologists instead. What they had stumbled onto, in a quarter-acre pond a few miles from the launch pads of Cape Canaveral, was a burial ground roughly 7,000 years old. The site is called Wendover, and over several seasons of excavation, the team, led by researchers from Florida State University, recovered the remains of around 168 people. They ranged from newborns to individuals over 60, men and women in nearly equal numbers, spanning more than 1,000 years of use. These were archaic peoples of Florida, hunter-gatherers who lived long before the pyramids of Egypt were built. And the conditions in the pond had done something almost unheard of. The bodies had been placed in the peat under shallow water and staked down. And the peat is neutral, oxygen poor, and cool. The kind of chemistry that stops decay in its tracks. The remarkable thing at Wendover is not the bones. It is what was still inside the skulls. In roughly 90 of them, archaeologists found preserved human brain tissue, shrunken and delicate but intact, the oldest brain matter ever recovered in such quantity. Scans and microscopes revealed recognizable structures inside these ancient heads. For that to happen, each body had to have been buried in the peat within a day or two of death, before the Florida heat could destroy it. This was not a place where the dead were dumped. It was a place they were carried to quickly and laid down with care. The pond preserved more than flesh. It held the oldest woven fabric ever found in the Americas, dozens of fragments of textile made from plant fibers, hinting at clothing and bags and matting far more sophisticated than we once credited to people of that age. 7 different weaves were identified. Some of them worked so finely that the cloth approached the thread count of a modern shirt, and the bodies had been held down. Sharpened wooden stakes were driven around and through the burials to pin them beneath the surface of the pond, keeping them submerged in the airless peat where nothing could reach them. And genetic material survived in the tissue, enough for early studies to suggest that the people of Wendover were a small, tightly related community, a group that returned to this one pond generation after generation to bury their own. There is nothing above the site now. The remains are curated by the state, kept for study rather than reburied, with the agreement of the tribes connected to the land. A shallow Florida pond, the kind you might drive past without a glance, held the faces and the woven cloth, and even the thoughts, or the vessels that once held them, of a people who were laying their dead to rest in the water 7,000 years ago. And it kept them so gently that we can still hold a piece of an archaic mind in our hands. Number 4. The 2 bodies made from 6 people. On the island of South Uist, in the windswept Outer Hebrides off the west coast of Scotland, archaeologists digging beneath the floors of a Bronze Age village found 4 skeletons. They lay beneath the foundations of a row of roundhouses built around 3,000 years ago, buried at neat intervals. An adult man, an adult woman, a girl in her early teens, and a small child. At first this looked like a known, if grim, practice, the kind of foundation burial in which the dead are placed under a building to protect or bless it. The bodies were tightly flexed, arranged, deliberate. The excavation, led by Mike Parker Pearson, seemed at that stage to be uncovering something somber but familiar. Then the radiocarbon dates came back, and they did not agree with each other. When different bones from the same skeleton were dated, they returned different ages, sometimes centuries apart. That should not happen in a single body. A body dies once. But these bodies, it turned out, had not died once. Closer study revealed the truth. The male skeleton was a composite. Its skull came from one person, its jaw from a second, its torso from a third. 3 individuals assembled into one convincing whole and buried as a single man. When ancient DNA was recovered from the female skeleton and compared bone by bone, she proved to be the same kind of assembly. Her jaw, her arm, and her thigh drawn from different people. 2 buried bodies, built from the parts of at least 6. And the parts had a history before they were joined. The microscopic structure inside the bones, the fine architecture that is normally destroyed by the bacteria of decay, had survived. Which means the bodies had been preserved soon after death, most likely by being sunk for a time into an acidic peat bog. then pulled out, dried, and kept. The chemistry of the bone surfaces backed this up. They had been very slightly dissolved, etched by acid in a way that ordinary burial in the shell-rich Hebridean sand could never explain, but that a spell in a bog would. Immersed just long enough to fix the flesh, then lifted out before the bog could eat the bones entirely, the bodies had been deliberately, skillfully mummified. The dates suggest they were then curated for generations, before they were finally taken apart, recombined, and laid beneath the houses of the living. For a long time, the people of this village kept the mummified dead among them, and then merged them. Why anyone would do this is genuinely unknown. One idea is that combining ancestors from different family lines into a single body was a way to fuse those lineages, to make one shared ancestor out of many, and so to bind a community together beneath its own homes. It is a careful reading of a very strange act, and it may not be right. What is certain is only this. On a cold Scottish island 3,000 years ago, people made mummies, kept them for lifetimes, and then built new individuals out of the old dead. The bones can be sorted and sequenced. The idea in the minds of the people who joined them is gone, and it is one of the eeriest silents in European prehistory. Number 3. The chamber almost no one can reach. In the cradle of humankind, a stretch of Dolomite caves northwest of Johannesburg in South Africa, there is a passage so tight that most adults cannot pass through it. To get into the Dinaledi chamber, you crawl through a gap called the Superman's Crawl, climb a jagged wall, and then lower yourself down a vertical chute barely 18 centimeters wide in places, dropping some 12 meters into the dark. When bones were discovered at the bottom in 2013, the team could not send in most of its members. They advertised for excavators who were qualified, small, and unafraid of tight spaces, and the ones who went down, all of them women, became known as the underground astronauts. What they brought up was extraordinary. The chamber held the remains of at least 15 individuals, of a previously unknown human relative, now named Homo naledi. More than 1,500 fossil fragments were eventually recovered from that single chamber, the richest haul of hominin remains ever made in Africa. The creature the team reconstructed stood about 1.5 meters tall, walked upright, and had hands and feet close to our own, but its skull enclosed a brain only about 1/3 the size of ours, roughly the size of an orange. It had a curious mixture of features, some ancient, some strikingly modern, and dating placed these creatures far later than such a small brain would suggest, somewhere between roughly 230,000 and 335,000 years ago, meaning Homo naledi was walking the African landscape at the same time as the earliest members of our own species. The bones lay deep inside a cave that, as far as anyone can tell, was always dark and always hard to reach, with no evidence that these individuals lived or died there by accident. That alone was startling. A small-brained hominin was somehow getting bodies into a chamber that is difficult even for a trained modern human with a headlamp. But here's where the claim outran the evidence. In 2023, the team went further, announcing that Homo naledi had deliberately buried its dead in dug graves, and that it had carved engravings into the cave walls, behaviors long thought to require a brain like ours. These claims were released to the public and featured in a documentary before they had passed peer review, and when scientists examined them, the response was overwhelmingly critical. Papers in leading journals of human evolution argued that the case simply had not been made, that natural processes had not been ruled out, and that the marks on the walls had not been shown to be either deliberate or old. In the years since, the team has published revised, more detailed work, and some critics have softened on one point, that the bodies really do seem to have been carried deep into the cave on purpose. But whether that amounts to true burial, with all the meaning that word carries, remains sharply disputed, and the engravings remain unproven. That is where the science honestly stands. The safer conclusion is the more limited one. Something was deliberately moving the dead of a small-brained species into the most inaccessible chamber it could find, hundreds of thousands of years ago. Whether it dug graves for them or drew on the walls above them, the evidence does not yet settle. The chute is still there, still 18 centimeters wide, still guarding a chamber full of bones that we can barely enter and cannot yet fully explain. Number 2, the pit of bones. Deep inside a hill in northern Spain, in a limestone cave system called the Sierra de Atapuerca, there is a place where the passage ends in a vertical shaft. It drops about 13 meters, straight down, into a small chamber far from any daylight. Spanish archaeologists gave it a blunt name. They call it the Cima de los Huesos, the Pit of Bones. And it holds one of the most important and most unsettling assemblages of human ancestors ever found. At the bottom of that shaft, excavators working since the 1980s have recovered thousands of hominin fossils, the remains of at least 28 individuals. Every part of the skeleton is represented, which has made these people among the best-known ancestors we have. Around 6,500 fossil fragments have come out of the pit, along with the bones of dozens of cave bears that also somehow ended up in the same deep chamber. One of the skulls, the most complete Middle Pleistocene human skull ever found anywhere, is so well preserved that the team gave it a name, Miguelon. The excavations, directed for decades by the paleontologist Juan Luis Arzuaga, turned this narrow shaft into one of the richest windows we have onto the deep human past. They belong to a population that lived here around 430,000 years ago, an archaic human once classified as Homo heidelbergensis, and now understood as an early branch on the road to the Neanderthals. Young and old, male and female, they went into the pit together. The obvious question is how? This is a chamber with no easy entrance, no evidence of people living in it, no sign that predators dragged prey down there. One camp of researchers argues the bodies washed or slumped in by natural means, or that these people fell to their deaths in some ancient accident. But the excavators who know the site best have long suspected something stranger and more human, that the bodies were deliberately placed here, dropped down the shaft into the dark on purpose, a single spot chosen for the dead. What makes the pit extraordinary is not the number of the dead. It is a single object found among them. In more than 3 decades of digging through thousands of bones, archaeologists have recovered exactly one deliberately made stone tool from the entire chamber. It is a hand axe, beautifully worked, shaped from a rare, reddish quartzite not commonly used in the area, and it shows no wear, as if it had never been used for any ordinary task. The team nicknamed it Excalibur. Its presence, alone among the dead, has been read as something almost impossible to prove and hard to dismiss. An offering, a single fine object sent down into the pit with the bodies. If that reading is right, it pushes the roots of symbolic behavior, of doing something for the dead beyond simply leaving them, back hundreds of thousands of years earlier than most researchers once believed possible. And these ancestors gave up one more secret. The bones of the Pit of Bones yielded some of the oldest human nuclear DNA ever recovered, genetic material read across an almost unimaginable gulf of time. It confirmed what the skulls had hinted, that these were people on the Neanderthal line, distant relatives of us all. It also deepened a puzzle, pushing the point at which their line and ours divided far back into a past we can barely resolve. 28 individuals at the bottom of a shaft, 400,000 years ago, and one perfect red hand axe among them. The bones can be counted and dated and read. Whether that single tool was a gift and what it was meant to say sits in the dark at the bottom of the pit, where we cannot follow. Number 1. The tomb no one will open. In 1974, farmers digging a well in the dry fields near the city of Xi'an in central China broke through into a buried pit and found themselves staring at a life-size soldier made of clay. It was the first of many. Excavation uncovered 3 great pits holding roughly 8,000 terracotta figures, soldiers, archers, horses, and chariots, arranged in ranks and facing east, a silent army standing guard where it had stood for more than 2,000 years. It is one of the most astonishing discoveries in the history of archaeology, and it is only the outer wall of something larger. About a kilometer from the pits rises a low, wooded hill. For 2 millennia, people had passed it without understanding what it was. Beneath that mound lies the burial chamber of Qin Shi Huang, the ruler who conquered the warring states and unified China in 221 before the Common Era, declared himself the first emperor, and died in 210. The terracotta army was never the tomb. It was the guard posted outside it. The tomb itself, the chamber under the hill, has never been opened. Not by looters, as far as anyone can tell, and not by archaeologists. It sits there, still, sealed, one of the greatest untouched burial chambers on Earth. And the tomb is only the heart of something vast. The mausoleum around it is the largest ever built in China, an underground necropolis sprawling across tens of square kilometers. And in the decades since 1974, archaeologists have found hundreds of separate pits scattered through it. There are pits of bronze waterbirds arranged along a buried watercourse. Pits holding half-sized bronze chariots so finely made that the reins and the parasols still work. Pits of clay acrobats and officials and stone armor. Every excavation on the outskirts turns up more, and all of it was built only to surround and serve the one chamber at the center that no one has entered. We are not ignorant of what may be inside. An ancient historian named Sima Qian, writing a little over a century after the emperor's death, described the tomb in remarkable detail. He wrote that the chamber held a model of the empire, with the great rivers and the seas reproduced in flowing mercury, mechanically made to move, and a ceiling above it fashioned to look like the night sky. He wrote other things too, darker ones. That crossbows had been rigged inside the tomb to fire automatically on anyone who broke in. That the craftsmen who had built it, and who therefore knew its passages and its treasures, were sealed inside the chamber when it was closed, buried alive with the emperor they had served. Those details cannot be tested from the outside, and some of them may be legend. For a long time, the whole account read like one. Then the ground was tested. The reason the tomb stays closed is not superstition. It is a measurement. When scientists sampled the soil of the burial mound, they found mercury, far above the natural background level, in some places dozens of times higher than the surrounding land, and concentrated most heavily in the pattern where Sima Qian said the rivers and seas should be. Instruments aimed at the air above the hill detected mercury vapor rising from it, the slow exhalation of an estimated 100 tons of the metal, still sealed beneath the earth after more than 2,000 years. The historian, it seems, was not inventing. There is very likely a poisoned model of a lost empire under that hill, and to cut into it carelessly would release toxic vapor on the people doing the digging and the land around them. The engineering that guards the chamber has held with unsettling success. Around the year 2000, surveys detected an ancient dam and drainage system built into the ground beneath the mound, designed to steer groundwater around the tomb rather than into it. 2,000 years later, it appears to have worked. The chamber, as far as the instruments can tell, has never flooded. Whatever the builders sealed inside is most likely still there, dry, ordered, and intact, waiting in the dark exactly as they left it. But mercury is only part of why the tomb stays shut, and not the deepest part. The deepest reason is a lesson archaeologists learned by watching something die in front of them. When the terracotta soldiers were first uncovered, many of them were not the gray we know from photographs. They were painted in bright, delicate colors, and within a very short time of being exposed to the dry air, that paint curled, flaked, and fell away, lost within minutes and hours after surviving for 2,000 years in the dark. It was a brutal demonstration of a hard truth. Opening an ancient sealed space is a one-way door. Whatever we do not have the technology to preserve, we destroy simply by looking at it. So China's heritage authorities have adopted a principle that sounds strange until you understand it. Preserve first. Excavate only when it can be done without loss. They have deliberately left the tomb of the first emperor closed, and have extended the same caution to the great imperial tombs of later dynasties, choosing again and again to leave them shut. In the meantime, they study the mound without breaking it, mapping its walls and gates and inner structure with radar and magnetic surveys, building a picture of the hidden chamber while leaving the seal intact. It has become, in the words of the people who study it, perhaps the greatest untouched time capsule on the planet, precisely because no one will touch it. There is something fitting about that, almost unbearably so. Qin Shi Huang spent the last years of his life obsessed with escaping death. He sent expeditions to find an elixir of immortality. He is said to have swallowed preparations of the very mercury that now guards his tomb, and it may have helped to kill him. He raised an army of clay to protect him for eternity, and built himself a model of the whole world to rule from beyond the grave. And in the end, of all the emperors and kings and ancestors in this list, he is the one who got exactly what he wanted. His chamber is the one grave we know how to find, could open tomorrow, and choose deliberately to leave undisturbed. The soldiers still face east. The mercury still rises from the hill. And the emperor lies where he lay himself down, behind a door that the most powerful tools we possess are, for now, forbidden to open. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.